it seems like even though it's cold, the world is sort of like back to normal. People are going out, they're like doing things, going indoors. I recently heard about a place that has really good like prime valet parking
Mm.
downtown.
If there's
And so
one thing we need,
valet parking, right?
yeah.
Like
How do we serve the folks who have money in this city? That's my big question.
I really like to ask that question like every morning when I wake up. I sort of like I get up, hands over my head, stretch, both feet on the ground, and think to myself,
what can we do to support the rich?
exactly. And there is a local establishment that has decided that the best way that they can support the rich is to block bike lanes with cars. They charge people for valet parking and then they park the cars in the bike lanes.
Do they charge them? I
don't know that, but
I mean, I guess valet does imply charging.
Yeah, and if you're not charged, there's some sort of like transactional situation going on.
Yeah,
Right?
valet
like
parking costs.
It costs money.
Okay.
Valet parking
you're rich, everything costs money.
We're totally burying the lead here. Go ahead, Shannon.
So what's the place called? Odd Cookie?
I thought it was Ookie Cookie.
Is it Ookie Cookie?
Is it odd? Oh, it's Odd Cookie.
What? Wait, what? You thought it was Ookie Cookie?
Don't worry about it, Flo.
Okay.
Yeah, so they are using the bike lanes, the protected bike lanes downtown to park vehicles, to valet park vehicles. So if you are downtown, just like
Friday,
trying to just on a Friday, Saturday night, trying to bike through, feel the wind, that Delta breeze in your luscious locks.
The utter audacity of parking these like, and it's like Granite Bay people with like expensive cars coming down, parking them in public space in the bike lane downtown. It's chef's kiss.
It also is a reminder that like we definitely give primacy to cars when it comes to the structure of our neighborhoods, right? And so we used to talk about this all the time. I used to be on the Active Transportation Commission, and when there is any kind of construction, we always find a way to keep the cars, and we tell the pedestrians basically, there's no more sidewalk now, figure it out.
Sorry.
But we will do what we can to keep a street open to cars, instead of saying, why don't we keep this open to pedestrians and make the cars figure it out? Like there's just a way that the car is king. And so this is like just a blatant display of disregard for the people who are using the bike lanes for their transportation, who are actually actively doing something good for all of us and the environment, right? Because, physical activity is good for our overall well-being, active transportation is good for the environment, and we are like, let us show you how little we care about all of that by prioritizing the car in all of this and literally putting them in the lane that was designated for you.
Yeah.
We would never do that for cars.
It is so impressive. This is something I didn't know that they did until somebody tweeted about this. I suppose it was on Sunday, November 28th. And somebody tweeted, there was at least one business on 9th, Odd Cookie, that is valet parking cars in the bike lane. Sometimes the vehicles get ticketed, but mostly they don't. Time to shut down this business. And I was like, that can't be true.
And then you see the pictures. And you're like, oh.
And then another pretty well-respected Sacramentan was like, yep, there were cars parked there again last night and people using it to unload. Even after communicating that they were parked incorrectly, they refused to move. Like, this is well known that these folks are just, and then on their Instagram, Odd Cookie said something to the tune of like, oh yeah, like the city said we could do it. It's cool.
So they're did we already say this? They're on J and Ninth. They're in the old, like, it used to be Blackbird, like a bar for a while. So this is like a spot that's billed as a bakery, restaurant, and bar. And they have like Fridays and Saturday nights. They've got VIP and bottle service. And like I love that it's a place that's like, we're a bakery, like you could come in and get yourself a chocolate chip cookie, but also like, you want a bottle of champagne, we got you. You want to block a bike lane with your vehicle, we're gonna make that okay. Just give us the keys to your car.
Well, council member Katie Valenzuela came out today saying, no, you're not allowed to park there. We're not sure where this confusion is, but we're not going to allow that anymore. So that's good.
Yeah. I mean, it's like that downtown having those protected bike lanes is really like such a game changer if you're someone who bikes downtown, right? Like it made biking through that downtown area so much easier. And to think that like you're just like on your way home from wherever and you're on, you're riding in this protected bike lane, and all of a sudden, like, yeah, it's incredibly frustrating. And I'm really glad that Twitter did it again. And like
Twitter continues to be undefeated.
Yeah, Twitter wins.
Okay, full disclosure, I have met the owner. I thought they were a good person when I met them. And I was bummed to hear about this, but like little by little, there have been a few things that I've just been like, man, this isn't cool for this business to do these things, even if I have a good rapport with this person.
Oh, yeah.
One of them being, I literally watched an unhoused man in a wheelchair asked to come in so he could buy a beer and enjoy his beer. And the guy at the door told him he could not because he had too many bags on his wheelchair. Yes. Full stop. And like, I didn't talk about it because I'm trying not to do the call out thing anymore, but like, I was just like blown away by that I just was, pretty disgusted.
That's terrible.
That's whack.
That's really whack.
Well, so we've got this like series of things. So I know where I will not be going for my Sunday mimosa brunch.
Yeah, no, thank you for me too. It's a solid first impression though.
Yeah. Totally. I mean, believe that people are who they say they are until they give you reason not to, right?
Yeah. And anti-unhoused culture like that just really, turned me off. Shall we move on to the show?
Let's do it.
All right.
Voices, the things they said. Voices, some from those dead. All the voices heard. Voices, things we say. Voices, they're in your head. All the voices heard.
Hello, everyone. You have Kempa.
Oh, and Shannon.
And Flo.
And no Skylar today. Skylar is moving from one home to another.
Yes, we're excited for him.
Moving further away from me, which is very sad, but I'll live. Closer to you, huh, Shannon?
Yeah.
And you too, Flo.
Yep.
Wow, the heart of voices has shifted.
It has.
I mean, it was going to happen at some point.
Oh, yeah. People move. It's okay.
Yeah.
So how was everyone's Thanksgiving weekend?
The weekend was good. My birthday was on Friday.
Happy birthday, Dr. Flo.
Thank you. And it's actually the day I was born, the day after Thanksgiving. So yeah, I had a good weekend, relaxing, and I have like millions of balloons in my dining room, and I have lovely flowers that I was given for my birthday. So
Beautiful.
I am feeling incredibly loved.
And Shannon.
Yes. My weekend was good. I was glad to no longer be in the emergency room, and super grateful to be with pals on the Russian River, just hanging out.
Yeah, so for folks who don't know, Shannon she literally signed in for last week's episode on the Zoom, and within 5 minutes had to bail because she had a medical emergency. And so we were all like, okay, whoa, oh, wow. But it's really good to see you okay and here with us today.
Yeah, I'm still really sad that I missed last week's show.
It was good. We got to dunk on a lot of people.
Yeah. I feel like the medical emergency was the universe saying they got it. Like, don't you don't need to say all those terrible things you were gonna say.
There are countless more episodes with countless terrible things to say. So
yeah.
So there's the world is your oyster. So yeah, happy birthday, Flo. Shannon, glad to have you back. I had a good weekend. I won $100 in Reno and blackjack, so that's fun.
Woo!
Dope.
Yeah. Let's get started.
Okay.
We've got a lot. I don't know. We've got 3 possible topics, but I'm guessing we'll probably only get to 2. So let's start with number 1. Gun violence. Not a great topic, not something everyone loves, and especially sort of a hairy topic, I think, in leftist spaces too, because I do support gun ownership in leftist circles, given the rise of the fascist creep in the US. I also fully understand that in the US, the number of guns that are out there circulating is absurd, and there is a public health crisis. So Shannon, you introduced this topic through the lens of a shooting that happened in really near downtown here in Sacramento. Can you talk us through what happened?
Yeah, this was a shooting that happened, I'm blanking on the date, but very recently. And it took place at about 10:30ish in the evening, as far as I recall. It was at CV Circle, which is just off of Broadway, near the old cemetery, where there were 2 people. So at the time that it happened, there was one person had died at the scene, and another person had been rushed in critical condition to the hospital, and that other person was a 7-year-old girl named Isabel. She later died in the hospital, and her 8th birthday was shortly thereafter. There was a lot of discussion on various social platforms around who and what and where. And I think the reason that this story is compelling for me is that it happened very close to downtown. It is one in a series of violent gun incidents that have happened here in our city. And in this case, we find out that this 7-year-old girl who died was experiencing homelessness with her family. And they were just stopping by sort of to say hi and hang out. The shooter was later caught. And that's a whole other, it's probably a whole other show that we could do on what happens from there. But yeah, just yet another like terribly tragic end to a story, you know, for multiple people and an entire community that are really dealing with the trauma of being further marginalized, I think, as
Yeah.
a result of this incident.
Now, Shannon, I originally wanted to talk about this at the top through the lens of, you know, the fact that this family was experiencing homelessness and sort of discuss that a little bit and pare that down. I think we should, but given the direction of our show, I think I'd like to start with Flo and talk with you, you know, you as an epidemiologist, as a public health expert, to talk us through gun violence as it is, or as it should be viewed, or if it should be viewed through a public health lens. You and I have talked about this a lot over the years, but last year in 2020, in not just in the US, but in California, gun violence, I think, was on the rise by about 30% year to year, which is a record. It's the most it's ever risen in a single year in the last century, I think. And so obviously we live in very, very different circumstances right now. This is a COVID America, it's a COVID world. This is a country in the US where inequity economically is more rampant than it's been in well over a century, or perhaps in our entire history in this country. First, can you just talk to us a little bit about the concept of gun violence through the lens of public health and where the barriers have been on that in the last few decades?
Yeah, Dave, it's a really great question. And I think the place to start is people are used to thinking about public health as being either infectious or chronic conditions, right? And even chronic conditions sometimes get, you know, a side eye from people like, why is that public health? And so when we're thinking about public health, what we're really talking about is the things that impact our well-being overall. And so gun violence certainly falls into it in terms of it is loss of life, loss of ability, and a major cause of trauma. But one of the things I also don't think that many people recognize is just how significant that loss of life is. So when we think about the life expectancy, which is one of the major public health outcomes that we look at in terms of how well is a society functioning, when societies are functioning really well, people tend to live longer. But gun violence is one of the things that contributes to the greatest loss of life expectancy, because people who are often killed by gun violence are younger, and so they lose more years of life. If you die at 15 or 20 or 25, and the life expectancy in your society is anywhere from 65 to 80 something, right? You've lost far more years than somebody who maybe dies of cancer at 57 or dies of heart disease at 62, right? Like they're just so many more years that you've lost. And so gun violence is really important because of how young often the victims are.
Can I throw out a number on that? According to the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence, in 2018, firearm deaths accounted for 919,185 years of potential life lost before the age of 65. That's more than diabetes, stroke, and liver disease combined in our country.
Yeah, and that's important because those are all major causes of death. And so to be able to say that, you know, this took more lives, more years of life, potential years of life, is really significant. The other reason why this is, and so important is because of the way that it impacts so many other people, right? So when we think about certain other diseases, like you obviously have a family of people, if somebody loses their life for any reason, that is impacted by this. But viewing violence and experiencing violence has a significant impact on the people around you in a way that, you know, watching grandma die from cancer doesn't have that same traumatic impact. And so there's a way in which gun violence also creates what we would call secondary and tertiary victims that are significantly harmed by this experience beyond just the grief and loss of a person. And so that's really significant to think about in terms of the ways in which it shapes how we move through our communities. It shapes how communities see themselves, and it also sets the ground for additional violence in the future. And so that's one of the reasons why violence researchers have talked about treating gun violence like an infectious disease, in terms of looking at patterns and understanding that, unlike the common conception of gun violence as being random and unpredictable and, you know, just something we sort of have to wash our hands of, right? See also other, you know, societal challenges that we talk about frequently on the show that everybody acts like we don't know why this happens. It just does. And so, but there are root causes and there are clear patterns that are associated with this. And we see those, you know, throughout the US and around the world, that if you have certain conditions, you're more likely to see violence. And that's the importance of the research, to be able to demonstrate that so we can start talking about strategies to disrupt those patterns.
Now, you know, back in the day when you and I would talk about this stuff, we would always try and, this is back when the NRA wasn't bankrupt, which is nice. It's good that that's happened. But, you know, we would talk a lot about how there were barriers to research in the public health realm because folks like the NRA had put a block on our ability to fund this kind of thing. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes. So for a while there, you know, especially at the federal level, there was not money flowing to the Centers for Disease Control and other researchers to look at gun violence as a public health problem.
NIH, National Institute of Health.
National Institute of Health, yeah. And so the idea there was that this is not something we want to study, because studying it would then, you know, lift up all the issues I just mentioned around there are patterns to gun violence and there are things that we could do to be able to prevent it. And there may be things that are directly in opposition to the interests of the NRA in terms of expanding gun ownership that may be important public health strategies. And so they really didn't want government involved in that in any way. And they didn't want funding for that. They really wanted to kill the traction on the idea of reframing gun violence in our country. And so for a very long time, that was the way that things were, and you just could not study these things. And so California has taken, lengths at times to be able to kind of circumvent that. And just because it's not supported at the national level doesn't mean that you are prohibited from doing things at the state level as well. And so, but it does create a piecemeal kind of approach where we can't look at, you know, even when it comes to police violence, for example, like we can't look at a national registry that's able to pull together all the things that are happening. We have to cobble together those statistics from newspaper headlines and other news sources, and press releases and things like that are coming out, instead of having an actual registry where people can go and look at patterns and be able to identify what's happening. And we don't really have those barriers in existence for other public health challenges the way we do for gun violence.
Now, when we talk about patterns, we mean certain demographic things, right? Certain things that like a person who commits gun violence falls under.
Right.
And that could be a number of things. And maybe you can talk to that a little bit. But we just passed a law back in September. I believe that was Assembly Bill 173.
Yep.
Wherein public health professionals can now sort of cobble together some of these demos of, these gun violence demos when this has happened within the state of California. So public health professionals can actually start to take a look at it, parse through it and say, okay, hey, what are the correlations? Are there determinants here? How can we better research this, right?
Absolutely, because one of the questions that's come up a lot is, we're constantly, having conversations about, laws around gun ownership and protecting people. But if you don't allow people to research it, we can't say, is the NRA right that these laws aren't actually working, or is the NRA wrong and these laws aren't actually working? Like, without the research, you know, you're blocking potentially, I mean, I'm not trying to throw a bone to the NRA here, but you're potentially blocking your blessing, because the data could show up and say, actually, you've been right all along, and that's not the thing, it's this other thing, right? But we don't know it if we're not allowed to study it. When we think about demographics, I think it's very easy for people to think, oh, this is going to be a way to be able to, you know, further criminalize, especially people of color, and in particular, you know, Black and Latino and Indigenous folks. And those concerns are rightly, you know, raised, because that is the way that America works, and our institutions have, you know, are embedded with racism. But it also allows us to open up. The flip side of that is when you have, you know, skilled researchers, it also allows us to open up the conversation beyond just, you know, those kind of obvious demographics, to actually being able to look at, like, you know, the history of violence, the history of gun use, the history of domestic violence, you know, where specifically in communities is the violence happening, what age demographics, what are, you know, what are the employment statistics, right? One of the big things we learned in domestic violence research is that partner unemployment is one of the major increases in domestic violence, right? And so recognizing those things allows us to be able to be on the lookout for some of the risk factors that could potentially cause a situation to be more violent, whether it's guns or just in general. So that's the importance of the research, is being able to hone in beyond stereotypes to better understand actually what's happening.
To be clear, you actually do, it sounds like, share some of the concerns folks have about information like this to be wielded in a racist way.
Absolutely. That's like anything we do in America, we need to be asking ourselves, what's the racism factor here? How is this going to play out for people, right? Like, what's the worst way this could show up, and then be aware of that and be guarding against it. And if we're not, we are basically burying our heads in the sand and saying racism doesn't exist and everything we do is colorblind and it's going to have equitable outcomes associated with that. And we know that's total nonsense. So we have to go into it saying, what are we going to do to guard against this being used in a way that is terrible?
Right.
Yeah. And I think socioeconomic factors obviously play a big part in this. And when you lay down socioeconomics within our country, obviously there are particular races that have been put upon, that have been pushed to the extremes of poverty for generations, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, without getting way too technical in this, but there is a school of thought, especially in public health, where, you know, racism or race is a proxy factor. And so anytime you're using it, you need to be clear about what you're trying to measure. Sometimes what you're trying to measure is actually the impact of racism, and then you should try to find better tools if you can. Sometimes what you're trying to measure is the impact of socioeconomics and, you know, historical policy, right? And so you just need to be clear when you're using race as a variable, that you're recognizing, it doesn't truly operate as a variable because it can't be changed in terms of our like construction of it. But so it doesn't have that variability factor that other variables literally have, that as part of the definition. But also you need to be clear about why you're using it and what you're actually trying to approximate by using it. Is it lived experience? Is it culture? Is it, you know, what? And because there's a lot of heterogeneity, there's a lot of difference, you know, within a group of people. So even when you're using it, like, what does that mean? And so that's a really important part. And that's why I said skilled researchers are better able to identify and understand that, and also look at the intersections of people's identities to better, you know, hone in on what some of those root causes are.
Yeah. Can I got to ask the question, I think, because a lot of leftists listen to the show. A lot of them are gun owners. A lot of them are very serious about the importance of having your own firearm. And given the fascist creep in the country, you know, they say we should defend ourselves when the cops won't. Obviously, cops tend to lean toward the fascist ideologies more often than not. Google 40% of cops, folks. what do we say to kind of the progressive to leftist space about doing research on things like this? Are they, should they be concerned about their own gun ownership?
I mean, I think, we would be remiss if we told anybody to not be concerned about how research will be used, right? And what the implications of that research will be. So no, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not listening, right?
Right.
So I would say yes, I think that's a valid concern. What I would also say is that the ability to do research and the ability to be able to have some sunshine on this information can be critical to being able to at least identify what's happening in our communities in a real way. Because I think for a lot of people, they assume that the biggest threat in their lives, for example, is, there is the homicide, right? Like gun violence, homicide, when actually in most people's lives, the greatest likelihood is that someone who has access to your firearm is going to die by suicide because of that, from that firearm, right?
Right.
And the data really bears that out, that like most of our gun violence deaths are actually self-inflicted. And so when you begin to think about it that way, then it brings up different considerations in terms of what does gun ownership mean? What does it mean when you're living in a household with multiple people? We talk about responsible gun ownership and, having locks and all of those kinds of things. But ultimately, right, like when you live in a house with people, people know the code and people know how to, get. So like, what does that mean when you have children in your home? What does that mean when you have, people who may be struggling with, depression and other mental health considerations, right? And so I think it's just important for us to be able to have the research so we can really talk about what does safety look like for our families and for our communities.
Right. And I think, just generally, we should not be afraid of research
Right.
in that regard. And to that point, in 2018, nearly 40,000 Americans were killed by gun violence, right? That's nearly 23,000 Americans from suicide by firearm, right? So that's over half. Each year, more than 13,000 die by firearm homicide, which is, actively shooting at another person. And then nearly 500 die from unintentional firearm injuries every year. So that's sort of the layout. And I think there is a deeper conversation to have on like, what can we do to really like bring this kind of pandemic number down, in the same way that we brought the number down with like car accident deaths, right, over the last few decades. And that's a public health thing, and public health helped do that. That doesn't mean that leftists shouldn't be able to defend themselves or have something that protects them against the fascist creep. Shannon, can you talk a little bit about the confluence of maybe not just gun violence, but maybe just gun violence, but also just violence and the status of homelessness, and learning that this family, where this young girl and this other family member died, they were unhoused?
Sure. Yeah, I think that one of the things that sticks out to me is that when people in positions of power systematically position folks who are experiencing sort of a collective socioeconomic struggle in certain spaces. For example, you've got CV Circle, that has been a space that just has been under-resourced, has not been paid, and there's just not been enough attention paid to that space because of all of the reasons, that all of the injustices that we know to be true. But when you put folks in these sort of like communal spaces of suffering, it is not even remotely surprising that these big traumas occur, right? Like, and you already have families who are experiencing the trauma of homelessness. You have this family, Isabel's family, who's experiencing the crisis and trauma of homelessness, who stops by to like see a friend and then look how their night ended up. Violence is part of the normal day in and day out experience of people, of unhoused folks. And gun violence certainly does not find itself on like the tippy top of the list. You end up with more sort of like blunt force trauma and sexual assault, and you do end up with drug related fatalities and things like that. But that doesn't mean that this is any less important to pause for. And I think that the sort of, for me, it's always like, well, what's the next step after this? Like, we learn this story about this family experiencing homelessness, and that they're now experiencing this incredible like trauma on top of traumas that we don't even know about, probably, right? So they're just living with compound trauma and probably compound grief at this point. And I think that there just really needs to be a space where we can recognize that, where accountability has to happen, right? We have to I think that there has to be some accountability by our local spaces for, one, not investing enough in research, not having equitable housing solutions, not valuing all communities in the same way, right? Sorry, I sort of like went off on a tangent there because I started thinking about some other things as I was answering that question. But in general, where the experience of homelessness and violence meet is often, too often, probably as we're recording this show. And
the Venn diagram is a circle, right?
Yeah. And this just, this is just one of those stories where it happens to have impacted a very, very young child. And that's truly tragic, and it's horrible, and it's a mark of injustice. And unless the city of Sacramento, the county of Sacramento, decides to invest in, the research and, public policy that uplifts equity, we're just going to continue to see this happen over and over and over again.
That's sort of, I mean, again, we don't have the data on this because the federal government has literally stopped us from collecting it, but it increasingly appears to be that poverty, extreme poverty, is a huge determinant of violence, either inflicted upon you or that you might inflict on others. And were we to ameliorate that, to lower our poverty levels, to make sure people's needs were met, instances of violence would drop profoundly in this country. Given what COVID has done to our working class, lower classes, it is no surprise that violence is on the rise. And you have the neoliberal consensus teaming up with conservative ghouls to say that this is what happens when you defund the police, but we haven't defunded any of our cops,
right?
And yet this has already happened, right?
And also,
go ahead.
they don't do prevention. I can't say it often enough, but like, that's not the role that they're playing. I know people like to think that they're playing some deterrent factor, but they're not engaged in primary prevention. And so that's like, and if they are, then I would argue that we should get a refund, because if this is what primary prevention looks like, we're not doing so well.
I mean, and there's this, I think that there has to be some recognition that, like, and I don't think it's just gun violence, but violence there are times when this happens out of a means of survival, right? And crime is a construct and all of that. Like, I think we need to like mention that for sure. But you have, like, we talked about this on the show before, where it's like you've got people stealing, talk about crime being a construct, like loaves of bread, or, you know, stealing food. There's like all of these like small theft thing, and it's like, this is
the Aladdin theory. Yes,
right. And this is like survival stuff. But then you get to the point, I mean, and again, we have to have the research to show it, but you just push people further and further out and leave them like forgotten over and over and over again. And it's just no surprise that this sort of terrible loss and trauma and violence happens, like when you leave people to fend for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I don't. And the cops aren't, like Flo said, the cops aren't going out and doing there's no prevention strategy, right? Like, they show up. What happens
after the fact?
They show up after the fact, and then in the immediate wake of, you know, of incidents, in an effort to potentially like get the bad guy or to like deter the bad guy. And it's like, that's not actually taking any sort of
initiative.
And right, it's not taking any initiative, and it's not like doing the thing, which is like looking at the landscape of where we've been and how we got here, and, you know, using experience to take measured and principled action.
Flo, we have at least one program at the city level that has worked towards, you know, working with young folks to sort of move them away any direction toward you know, a violent future. And this is one of those things that is sort of, it really is the idea is to nip it at the bud, right? It is to start creating alternatives to young folks who later in life will start thinking they don't have alternatives. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, I didn't have like a call to action at the end of this, but maybe that is a good one.
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, this has come up a lot. It came up during the pandemic. It's come up more recently, you know, about funding our violence prevention programs. And they do run the gamut of prevention. And so one of the big things is a lot of people like to focus on, you know, the early primary prevention, right? Getting people before they get involved. And that is incredibly important. But one of the things, and this is kind of where, you know, gun violence may differ from some of the other public health, you know, issues that we're trying to address, is that the secondary prevention is also in some ways primary prevention for this. And what we mean by that is that even if you try to get to all of the people who, you know, as young as possible and try to give them what they need, if you don't also get the people who are in that pipeline already, then you end up creating people who are victims and people who are there to entice the next, you know, group in, right? And so you really have to be working at both levels at the same time. And there's been a way sometimes in the city where those, you know, secondary prevention programs, those programs like Advanced Peace, who are working, you know, with the higher, you know, the more involved populations often, and higher, what I would consider to be higher need populations, right? And in some ways higher risk populations, then get pitted against the primary prevention programs. And I always jokingly say, Advanced Peace and Girl Scouts both can be violence prevention, but they're working with very different populations and they require different skill sets, and they both need to be funded, right? And so we can't just look at it as, oh, I gave all my money to Girl Scouts, let's hope that's not, like, you also have to address the folks who who are at a different stage of that pipeline. And that's one of the things that the city has been less comfortable with. Advanced Peace and other programs like it have gotten a lot of pushback and criticism from people saying, they're not effective and this, that, and the other. And the data don't bear that out.
I have a guess on which council member felt that way.
Of course.
Was it a very white one? Was it somebody like in a northern part of Sacramento?
That we
was it somebody running for senator? Does the name rhyme with Flangelique Brashby?
And the constant push, and the constant push to give the money to people who are doing very different work, because she always feels, there's a big push, and I get keeping things local, but there's also this big push. I think sometimes it's used as a way to be able to avoid actually making progress on things by gassing up other people who are not necessarily doing the same work and saying, well, why can't they be the ones to get it? And it's like, because they don't do gun violence work, Angelique, that's why. Because that person doesn't do reparations work. So stop name dropping them in the middle of city council meetings.
Right.
Even if they are our friends. Yeah.
Yes. Even if they are, and they're at home like, what? Why me? Right. So
they find out on Twitter.
Yeah.
Like, huh?
Yeah. So like, I did what? Now that's not my background actually. So I just wanted to lift that up as a really important piece of, we can't have the violence prevention being pitted against each other, and being given too little money for anybody to be able to do their work. They need each other. And a lot of the folks are working together. And so I really hate the way sometimes the city sets up these like Hunger Games to make it so that everybody is now competing with one another, when it really should be a collaborative process of where the warm handoffs occur and how they're all aware of what everybody else is doing.
What was the call to action there?
The call to action is that when you see funding coming, especially as budgets are coming up, we're going to be doing mid-year revisions in the next month or so. We're going to be, we're already back in budget season, really. And so as that comes up and you start seeing days where, violence prevention is an item on the agenda, or just general budget conversations, bringing this up and reminding us that this is one of the duties of the city, that they can't punt to the county, that they should not be punting elsewhere, but they really should be thinking about how they're funding their own programs.
Cool. Thank you. I knew this topic would go long. It went very long.
I think it's good.
No, it's great. And I'm glad we covered it. And there's more to cover, right? I mean, it's one of those things where there's a reality that like guns will be around, especially this new ghost gun thing. It's like they're just going to be around. So how do we mitigate? How do we ameliorate? And how do we as police abolitionists approach something like this? Because I think it's a really hard question, but I think it's really important that we approach it. Can we take a quick moment to discuss just real big lie that finally came out to the forefront? And our friend of the show, Robin Epley, over at the Bee, the columnist, she wrote a piece lambasting the county, really everyone in the region, because it's not just the county, it's not just conservatives, it's also the neoliberal consensus. They all came out with this big lie that, there was E. coli in the American River and we couldn't enjoy the river. And their reason for it was all these unhoused people were using the river as their restroom. And it came out a few days ago that is not in fact the case, that the real source of the E. coli was from bird and dog droppings. So it's not even human created. Not only that, there's an environmental group with a very strong case against the county for suing them because they believe they're putting sewage into our river system. So even if there is human waste, this could have been the county that put it in there. So we spend all this time blaming our unhoused community, these folks who have no way to defend themselves. They can't write op-eds. They're not like, they don't have the political clout, the social capital to do that. And here we are sort of living this reality, and word comes out that they are not to blame for any of this. Shannon, I think you're the person to throw the ball to on this.
I mean, just like right out of the gate, this is not surprising at all, right? Like, I think it's just another one of those things where you're like, yep, of course, people in power have abused said power, to no surprise. And I think at the time that all of this goes back over a decade ago, back like Oprah doing the whole like tent city thing. This was like 2008, maybe 2007, when there was like talk about just like there not being clean, like potable water for people experiencing homelessness, and like this whole like trickle down effect that comes all the way to, we've got our elected officials who are talking about how unhoused folks are just contaminating the jewel of Sacramento.
The jewel of Sacramento.
Right. The parkway, right? Like the American River is the jewel of Sacramento. Like, I'm pretty sure that's
Friends of the American River Park. It drives me nuts. These people who hide behind environmentalism for their anti-homeless fucking bullshit. And I think like part of the point is that we can hold up multiple issues at the same time, like environmentalism and homelessness and any number of other things can all be considered in the same space as equally important things to put our passions and money and support behind, right? But when you weaponize it,
and that is the issue, is that all of a sudden when you have like these groups or like subpopulation against subpopulation weaponizing, at this point it was like weaponizing the need to go to the bathroom. It's just total bullshit. And I think just once again, it's like all of those like legal actions that are taken when the city or the county take people's belongings, and as they're doing like a camping sweep. We just find again that there was some hasty reaction on the part of people in power who actually just feel like they can easily shift blame, and that nobody is actually going to think too much about it because folks experiencing homelessness, like there's so many people who don't give a shit anyway, right? And then you have groups that actually do and spend time doing the research, and then they come out and they're like, so this problem that you blamed on folks who have nothing was actually potentially one that you created yourself.
Right.
I think it is a very, very special conclusion to, well, I guess it's not a conclusion, but we found ourselves at a very special place with this whole thing, which is that potentially the county has it was them all along.
So that part is infuriating, right? That the whole time that we were gaslighting our most vulnerable population, our most marginalized population, that they were actively participating. This would be bad enough if they were just blamed and it was actually Byrd and dog feces
Right.
that was in the river. That would be bad enough in and of itself.
This is
right?
next level.
Because that's just scapegoating.
Right.
And just deciding who was to blame without actually having any evidence that that's what's going on. But then to actively be the one doing the dumping, it's like a special brand of evil.
Oh yeah.
Like
it also does this thing which is so infuriating to me every time. It's like the hill that I choose. Stop stereotyping folks, unhoused folks. Stop fucking doing it, because they're not a monolith, for one. Like, it's not like, are there people who do the thing that you have built your stereotype on? Sure. But there are housed people that do the same shit. So,
because I have definitely pooped up and down the American River while out for a run.
You never let us forget it, Flo. And I love that.
I try to bring bags with me, but there is obviously like there's only so much. And sometimes you gotta go. You gotta go. And so I am willing to throw all of the other runners and bikers under the bus as well and say, I'm not the only one. And so the idea that we blamed it even on people experiencing homelessness, when the truth is there's a lot of people pooping and peeing along the American River.
Yeah.
Yep. No question.
It's what our bodies do.
Also they're not great bathrooms along the American River either, especially in certain sections. They don't even have running water.
Why is that?
Right. And
because they don't want unhoused people to have access to bathrooms. Correct. And then they're pissed when people shit along the jewel of Sacramento.
And Shannon's not making this up. The United Nations came out here during the Kevin Johnson era, and they denounced us for turning off our water supply, for removing all possibility for our unhoused community to use facilities the way that every human being needs to. This is what we do. We are performing human rights violations every day here in the Sacramento region.
And that was like a huge deal, that there was all kinds of like press around that. It's like, you are actively contributing to the suffering of human beings, and look where we are today. And that was over 10 years ago that happened.
Just think about all of the ways in which like basic human hygiene is a way to be able to improve our health. So when we're talking about everything from the common cold to the flu, being able to wash your hands on a regular basis is incredibly important. When you think about pink eye, and when you think about E. coli poisoning and all of these other things, like, you want people to have access to facilities to be able to wash their hands. That is an important part of just keeping ourselves healthy. And so when you deny people access to that, you are inevitably saying that those people are going to be more likely to experience all of the harms that come along with that. Like, it's not acceptable.
Those people who already are experiencing an incredible number of negative health impacts, right? And you're just like, you know what? Here's some more.
Yeah. The thing that this ties together for me is that the conservatives of yesteryear and the Kevin Johnson neoliberals of yesteryear are very much not that far off from the Darrell Steinberg, quote unquote, progressives of today, in that they're all capitalists. They all care much less about our folks who need the most, and much more about our folks who have money to give to their campaigns. And I think that that's backwards and scary and sad. I feel like something's shifting. I really, and again, maybe this is me doing my sweet summer child moment at the end of an episode, but like, I feel like there is a shift. I feel like we are at a moment, an influx moment, where at what point, like, it just feels like people are really changing their minds on a lot of these things. It's a Hooverville moment, right? It's a pre-New Deal movement, but I don't think I don't think Democrats of California or a Biden America is going to come up with the New Deal. And I think that this is a real social movement, and I think it's going to happen real fast. And I don't think they're going to know it's going to hit them.
Well, I hope so.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. The same thing. I was like, well, I hope so.
I don't know. I don't think we've seen this level of pain in our country in a century, and on a wide scale like this. And that's what you need. You know, we're not trying to have a bourgeois revolution of, you know, like France beating the monarchs or whatever in the 1800s. What we're trying to do is a worker movement, right? A movement of the lower classes, where we realize that there are so many more of us than there are of them. And when things get so hard like this, I always kind of look to that as like, man, maybe it's time. Maybe this is it. Because they're not going to do it. They're not going to do what they need to do to stop this.
No.
Well, speaking of finding ways to stop things that we don't want to keep happening, Dave, tell me, where can I find more content like this that'll give me calls to action and good info about what's happening so that I can be part of the revolution when it starts?
That's a great seg flow, because I want to stop this episode and I no longer want it to happen because I have to edit it tonight, and I take about 4 times as long as our decorated technical editor takes to edit an episode. So let's round this out. You all know Voices River City. We all exist in a place called voicesrivercity.com. We're on social, Facebook, Voices River City, Twitter and Instagram at Voices River City. We have a store, voicesrivercity.com/shop. Merry Christmas. Some great gift ideas on there. See that mug? Not just Flo's face, but the mug next to her mug. It's a good looking mug. We also have the SAC Follows the Money project. We are planning on doing that for the city council races in 2022. I've already started up on District 5, obviously, because that's going to be a real barn burner. And there's a lot more to come there. And really, that's sort of central, I think, in local politics, as far as us trying to pull corporate money out of our politics, right? It's a good start. Beyond that, you can find our podcast everywhere you can find a podcast. We have a meetup coming up. What is it, December 11th? Is that what we said?
Oh boy, you're gonna have to edit this part
out.
Are
we still forgetting this?
I gotta look it up.
We haven't decided a place yet either.
Yeah, it's coming up. We'll tell you.
Okay, we'll tell you. That's a Friday. It'll be fun. It'll be early evening.
If it's a Friday, it's not December 11th because that's a Saturday.
Oh, I thought the 12th was a Saturday.
12th is Sunday.
Oh dear. We'll get back to you on that, folks. In any event, in the meantime, we will tell you on our Twitter feeds when this is. I am on Twitter at Unokempo, YUKNOWKEMPA.
Oh, I am Shan N.D. Stevens.
And I am Flojaune, FLOJAUNE.
I think you all know who Skylar is.
Yes. And you can find him at Guillotine for You. That's Guillotine, the number 4, YOU.
All right. I think that's our show. I think we did pretty good.
Yeah. Shit. Oh, I think we
Sorry,
did.
Mickey.
Great.
We're just giving you late work
I
now,
was like,
man.
we did so well the whole episode, and then we just decided to just like, nah.
Yeah, we're all like, fuck
it.
Okay, let's stop this so that neither he nor I have to do more work. All right.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.